Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. We are now up to Part 6, the penultimate entry, in our series on understanding transgenderism. If you've missed any of the previous installments, please check those out first. Links are in the description below. But if you're all caught up, we're going to pick up right where we left off, because last time we talked about some of the ways that claiming a new gender identity can feel therapeutic, where the alienation that is so often experienced seems to be relieved. But we also said this is an illusion. And that's the really sad thing about this whole topic. And it all goes back to the fact that experience is not the same thing as the interpretation of that experience, like we talked about way back in Part 1. Everybody needs to think critically about whether their interpretation is a good interpretation, whether their explanation of their experience is a good explanation. But consider that experience for a moment. For many of these people, first you experience this alienation from your gender, where you just don't fit in with other boys or other men or other girls or other women. And then, after you identify as the opposite gender, well, suddenly you start feeling an acceptance that you never felt before. You feel more at home with this new gender identity than you ever felt before in the old one. And so the transgender interpretation of that experience is that, well, it means you really are a member of the opposite sex. That, deep down inside, where it's undetectable by any objective measure. But it feels better. And for people who are severely alienated for one reason or another, any significant relief in those feelings of alienation, that's huge. That's a big, big deal to them. And so identifying as the opposite gender, it feels like you're finally coming home to your true self, that this is where you really belonged all along. But there are a lot of good reasons to believe that the best explanation for that experience is that changing genders is really just a temporary escape into a kind of fantasy. And like most escapes into fantasy, it makes things feel better for a little while. But it doesn't really solve anything at the same time. And we already talked about the disregard or the denial of biology, particularly with respect to divine ordinance and Holy Scripture back in Part 3. And we talked about how that is just the logical progression of that old saw from feminism, right? That men and women are basically the same in every way that matters except for their genitalia. And really all the trans movement did was remove the genitalia exception from that sentiment that so many of us imbibed growing up. But all those problems that we talked about back then they're really just symptomatic of a deeper problem with this whole endeavor. It's a deeper problem than whether your biology matches the stereotypes that are associated with your biology, right? That's what gender originally was. The more fundamental problem is this. If a boy who thinks he's a girl really is a girl, what does the word girl even mean at that point? What does the word girl mean if a boy can really be a girl? Well, it can't mean anything biological. I mean, that's the whole point of the transgender explanation, is that it's disassociating gender from biology. It can't mean anything biological, because then a boy who thinks he's a girl would objectively not be a girl. The whole point is to disentangle that. So it can't mean anything biological. It can't mean anything, saying that you're a girl, it can't mean anything mental or social either, though. Because, as we've all been taught to believe, those are just meaningless, outdated stereotypes. And they're fluid, and they can change all the time, and it's just a bunch of prejudices. And surely, those are going to disappear any moment now. And that's kind of a big issue, right? You can't really refer to anything, particularly social or mental. I mean, if even having a vagina isn't explicitly female, well, is having long hair then explicitly female, or wearing a dress, or liking nail polish? Girls don't have to act or think in a particular way to count as girls. At least I certainly hope we're not holding them to those kinds of standards for being a girl. And it can't mean anything spiritual either, being a girl. It can't mean anything spiritual either, that transgender people have female souls or spirits in male bodies. Because if that is the case, if that's really what all this is about, then the whole movement It is nothing more than an attempt to impose a state religion by force through the public schools, through all of our supposedly secular institutions. So, and I'm saying, some people do think about it that way, that they do feel it, that's a spiritual matter, but that does not work its way into the public rhetoric and the public arguments on this issue, because once you go there, then it goes back to a matter of imposing religion by force. And so once you get rid of those three, once you cut out body, mind, and spirit, well, what do you have left? You haven't really got anything left for the meanings of words like boy and girl. And this whole thing just ends up being a snake eating its own tail. If a man says, I identify as a woman, but that's only believable because the word woman is so fluid that it's objectively meaningless, then he hasn't said anything at all when he says that he's a woman. He hasn't said anything at all. It's just a meaningless noise. And if there are no grounds whatsoever to say that somebody claiming to be a woman is not actually a woman, and that's where this is going, you cannot say that their claim is false. But if there's no falsifier there, then claiming to be a woman doesn't really mean much. If there's absolutely no falsifier to it, then it is a meaningless assertion. So that's the thing about this. Extreme gender fluidity, it cuts both ways. You cannot have your cake and eat it too on this subject. So once it's okay to claim the opposite gender, what you've really just done is destroy the concept of gender altogether, because there's nothing tying it to anything at all. But there are other reasons to interpret the transgender explanation as an escape into fantasy. And for example, very often the acceptance that they receive, they learn relatively quickly that it was never really real acceptance. And it seems that there are a whole lot of people, or at least a lot of the people who have transitioned back to their original gender, they've realized exactly how quickly that acceptance ends. And I'm going to read you a number of excerpts from a recent article by Jamie Shoup. I'm going to link to the article in the description below if you want to read for yourself. But he was the first officially non-binary person in the United States. His court case forced Oregon, I believe, to put a non-binary option on their driver's license. And I believe that's the case in 11 states now. Or at least it was the last time I checked. But So that's who he is, but he now realizes that his original explanation for his experiences was very, very faulty, and that's what he writes about in this article. Quoting from it here, 4 years ago, I wrote about my decision to live as a woman in the New York Times, writing that I had wanted to live, quote, authentically as the woman that I have always been, and had, quote, effectively traded my white male privilege to become one of America's most hated minorities. 3 years ago, I decided I was neither male nor female, but non-binary, and made headlines after an Oregon judge agreed to let me identify as a third sex, not male or female. Now, I want to live again as the man that I am. So, stopping the quoting here, Jamie's transition began in 2013, when during what he describes as a mental health crisis, he convinced himself that he really was a woman. And he effectively, he strong-armed nurses and therapists into assisting him in adopting that identity. He writes, all I needed to do was switch over my hormone operating fuel and get my penis turned into a vagina. Then I'd be the same as any other woman. That's the fantasy the transgender community sold me. It's the lie I bought into and believed. Only one therapist tried to stop me from crawling into this smoking rabbit hole. When she did, I not only fired her, I filed a formal complaint against her. She's a gatekeeper, the trans community said. Professional stigmatisms against conversion therapy had made it impossible for the therapist to question my motives for wanting to change my gender. But, and stopping quoting here, but though his transition began there, his story began much, much earlier. Because in his childhood, Jamie was severely abused. He was sexually abused by an uncle, and he was severely beaten by his parents. And so he experienced all this trauma and sexual abuse that resulted in hypersexuality, which he indicates should have been a red flag for any psychiatrist that was talking to him. But nobody, other than psychiatrists that he fired, ever tried treating him along those lines. As far as Jamie's concerned now, autogynephilia, which we talked about a few episodes ago, that explains his issue quite adequately as far as Jamie's concerned. And again, that was a kind of a desperation for a feminine ideal that expresses itself in a sexual arousal at the image of oneself as a woman. To an attempt to kind of become that ideal oneself is how he experienced that. And that's what he now believes was the case for him, not that he really was a woman, but that he had this other psychological condition. And so his transition didn't satisfy him because it's fake. He never really was a woman in the first place. He writes, 3 years into my gender change from male to female, I looked hard into the mirror one day. And when I did, the facade of femininity and womanhood crumbled. Despite having taken or been injected with every hormone and anti-androgen concoction in the VA's medical arsenal, I didn't look anything like a female. People on the street agreed. Their harsh stares reflected the reality behind my fraudulent existence as a woman. Biological sex is immutable. It took 3 years for that reality to set in with me. When the fantasy of being a woman came to an end, I asked 2 of my doctors to allow me to become non-binary instead of female, to bail me out. Both readily agreed. After pumping me full of hormones, the equivalent of 20 birth control pills a day, they each wrote a sex change letter. And the 2 weren't just bailing me out. They were getting themselves off the hook for my failed sex change. One worked at the VA, the other worked at Oregon Health and Science University. To escape the delusion of having become a woman, I did something completely unprecedented in American history. In 2016, I convinced an Oregon judge to declare my sex to be non-binary, neither male nor female. In my psychotic mind, I had restored the mythical third sex to North America, and I became the first legally recognized non-binary person in the country. And as part of, I'm stopping the quoting there. As part of that story, he also talks about all the support that he received from the LGBT community because of his transitions. He was published in the New York Times when he claimed to be a woman. And he was published in all sorts of different international publications when he ended up going non-binary. And he had all these different organizations calling him up to offer him legal support and to suggest new changes, like changing his passports and birth certificates and changing his legal name and so forth. And which again, when you're struggling with a kind of alienation, that's a really big deal. All these people are suddenly starting to care about you when it felt like nobody really cared about you before. And it feels like you're being restored to this community, and it feels like reconciliation. But even all that just turned out to be a fantasy, just one more fantasy, because as soon as he publicly raised questions about whether it's appropriate to permanently sterilize and physically mutilate children when it comes to gender transitions, he was treated as a pariah by that same community that was so accepting and so loving of him in the past. And I'm saying he was never cared for them as a struggling individual. They just cared for him as a tool that they could use to advance a political agenda, and one that they could throw away when he ceased being useful. I'm saying transitioning to a woman, it only worked for him for a couple of years. Transitioning to non-binary, it only worked for him for a couple of years. And having finally realized that this whole charade was just mirrors and smoke, he has decided to embrace being a man again. He concludes the article. In January 2019, unable to advance the fraud for another single day, I reclaimed my male birth sex. The weight of the lie on my conscience was heavier than the value of the fame I'd gained from participating in this elaborate swindle. 2 fake gender identities couldn't hide the truth of my biological reality. There is no third gender or third sex. Like me, intersex people are either male or female. Their condition is the result of a disorder of sexual development, and they need help and compassion. I played my part in pushing forward this grand illusion. I'm not the victim here. My wife, daughter, and the American taxpayers are. They are the real victims. And that's the thing with the Jamie, feelings of reconciliation and those feelings of acceptance, the feelings themselves, they don't always mean what you think they mean. And reality has a way of catching up with us. And last reason, escape to fantasy is a better explanation for this than that you really are somebody of the opposite sex. Pure self-identification is not reliable because our feelings are blind guides, especially for people who are in exceptional circumstances that are suffering in unusual ways. And I'm going to bring up another article here. Link is in the description below. And I'm just going to preface this by saying that this is ridiculous, what I'm about to read to you. But I want to be very clear here. Ridicule is not my purpose in bringing this up. So don't laugh at this, because if you laugh at this, you are going to feel really bad about it about 3 minutes later. So this is about a 33-year-old woman who transitioned to a man at 29, but now realizes that she isn't human at all, but that she is actually an alien. And she legally changed her name to Jareth, after David Bowie's character in Labyrinth. But this is what she says about it. After coming out as transgender and believing I'd finally found myself, I realized I was wrong. I wasn't male or female, or even human. I don't think or feel like humans. I can't really explain it to others. I'm simply otherworldly. I didn't feel comfortable as either gender, or even anything in between. I know I'm stuck in a human form, and that's how I'm perceived by others. But to me, I am an alien with no gender. I thought being a trans man would solve all of my issues and inner battles with finding out who I was. But I wasn't as happy as I expected to be. I felt like I was trying to fit into someone else's box. I didn't want to be constrained. That's when I discovered what agender was. I'd always been obsessed with aliens too, and what it means to be extraterrestrial. So the idea of being an agender alien fit perfectly as an identity for me. So, talk about alienation. That's alienation to the extent that she identifies herself as a literal alien. Better explanation, though. There's a better explanation for this. Jareth first felt that she did not fit in when she was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a rare, lifelong condition affecting the connective tissue in the human body. It results in a very, very stretchy skin and in an increased range of joint mobility. You can move your arms and your limbs a lot further than people normally can. And on top of that, it comes with a lot of chronic pain. And there is no cure. There's no real treatment for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. There's not anything you can do with it. And from all I read about this, it's a terrible thing to live with. And I totally understand why living with a condition like that would make you feel completely alien when your body is so much different than everybody else's around you. And you have to deal with this pain that hardly anybody else around you has to deal with. So it's totally understandable why she'd feel that way. But there is a huge difference between feeling like you're not even human and not actually being human. And that's the thing here. She is a human being. She is made in the image of God, just like all of us are. She's not an alien or an extraterrestrial. She's a human being who lives with a terrible burden in this condition that she has. But it's not the same thing as being an alien. Feeling like you're not even human. Not the same thing as not actually being human. And it's the same thing when it comes to being transgender. There's no less of a difference between feeling like you're not really a man or feeling like you're not really a woman and actually not being a man or not being a woman. That's not true. Even if it feels true. It's not true any more than feeling like an alien actually makes you an extraterrestrial. And that is where we are going to pause for now. So please like, comment, subscribe, share the videos. And join us next time when we conclude this series by considering the question, what then shall we do?